Hello, my name is Seth, and today I want to share with everyone why I'm no longer a Calvinist. To give you some background, when I was 21 I became a Christian, which is about 18 years ago. I became extremely zealous for Christ, inspired by men such as Leonard Ravenhill, A.W. Tozer, Ray Comfort, and other fiery preachers. I was regularly witnessing on the streets almost everywhere I went. I was super zealous for the lost, praying with intensity, striving for holiness on a deeper level, excited to share the gospel any way I could. I got married when I was 23. My wife became just as zealous as I was for the lost. We were excited newlyweds, sharing our faith at every turn. But then about 3 months into our marriage, something happened I was not expecting. My best friend became acquainted with something I'd only ever heard of called Calvinism. He began introducing me to the so-called doctrines of grace, the 5 points, gave me some resources. I remember one thing in particular was a CD sermon by John Piper as he was going through Hebrews, and it was on limited atonement and the case for it. Hugely convincing sermon to me at the time. I then began reading through Romans 9 with more Calvinistic lenses, and it was like getting new glasses. I could finally see what the scriptures were really saying. I'm sure if you're a Calvinist, former or current, you know exactly what I'm talking about. My wife and I soon left our Calvary Chapel church where we had friends, a very loving pastor who officiated our wedding, and catapulted ourselves into a very conservative, high liturgy Presbyterian church, strongly Calvinistic. We soon felt right at home because we were very into Calvinism at the time. Despite some of the flaws that the church had of some legalism, we still felt right at home. We really enjoyed ourselves, made a lot of good friends, and learned a lot along the way, not just related to the doctrines of grace, but the robustness of the Reformed faith. But interestingly enough, as soon as we got there almost, we were told by a very important member there that if I were going to do any open air preaching, that I would have to get a license from the denomination to do so. I was totally shocked at this, could not believe it. It just seemed like such a doctrine of man, but I accepted it. I understood why they were trying to prevent heresy, but looking back, it was probably the most cold water that could have been thrown on my fire at the time. So we got really wrapped up in the Calvinist system, and really our zeal for the lost all but dissipated. Without us even thinking about it, it just kind of happened. And looking back, I think really what happened was we just followed the logical ends of Calvinism, that God will inevitably bring his elect into the fold. We were told by our Calvinist friends to sort of assuage us in this way, that the God who ordains the end is also the God who ordains the means, and the preacher is the means in this case. So it was a way to say we do have some part to play in men's salvation, but we're just the vessel that carries the message, and that's it, right? So I used this mentality to sort of accommodate me to justify continuing to pass out tracts and share the gospel message with the lost as I was out on the streets, but it was much less, and certainly with less zeal, less vigor. Eventually we left this church after about 2 years and started attending a Sovereign Grace church, which was very different but similar in many ways because it was a charismatic Calvinist movement. It had its own strengths and weaknesses, but suffice it to say, on the church bookshelf were the same guys, Piper, Storms, Packer, you know the names. Within another 2 years, we found a small Southern Baptist a lot closer to home. We were having to commute a good way to go to this other church, and we're at this church to this day. I've been there a long time. And up till about 4 years ago, I was still holding on to my Calvinism, despite some of my deep down gut feelings of the mental gymnastics I was having to do to reconcile why I would be so zealous to reach the lost, only as a useful means to reach God's end of salvation for that elect person, whoever he was. And so how did I start to question Calvinism? It was probably through the work of N.T. Wright, who introduced me to a much more robust, bigger picture, bigger theology rather than systematic. Now, I don't agree with everything that N.T. Wright says. I don't agree with everything that anyone says. But a lot of what N.T. Wright has to say I don't agree with. But nonetheless, again, it gave me that bigger picture, biblical theology rather than a systematic theology. Not that one's opposed to another, it was just a sort of newer framework that I could kind of work within as I moved through the text. I wouldn't say this caused me to completely abandon Calvinism as I was learning through this time, but it definitely challenged a lot of my presuppositions and at least for the time shifted my focus. At one point in particular, around 2014, I distinctly remember though reading a passage from 2 Peter 2:1 from my Calvinist favorite ESV translation, where it says, "But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them." And I remember at the time thinking to myself, how can these false teachers deny the master Christ who bought them? It seemed completely incompatible with the Calvinist schema. I looked at the time to see what other Calvinists would say about this verse, finding one article on desiring God, but really seeing no persuasive essays or articles that I could find. They really did all fall short to explain this verse and how it would fit into limited atonement in particular and Calvinism in a more broad sense. And I actually found this was one of the verses that most Calvinists just stay away from altogether. They'll deal with the other big ones that Armenians throw at them, but not this one. And maybe Armenians don't do a good job of asking them about this verse. I've only heard a few non-Calvinists bring it up in debates. So it ruminated in me for a while, having been about a Calvinist for about 10 years at this time. But I still held on to my Calvinism, at least to some degree, continued to only listen to Reformed preachers, and read primarily from Reformed authors. Fast forward to about 2017, so this is a few years later, and then I began to really struggle with Calvinist doctrine. But it was one of those moments where I felt like I had to give it a last look at least, still kind of wanting to hold on to the doctrines of grace. I bought a few books on both sides of the debate, one of which I remember was The Potter's Freedom by James White. I read through parts of the book, mainly trying to see how he broke down what he called the big three, but I still came away unconvinced that I could hold on to these doctrines. And then at the time, simultaneously, I stumbled upon a Bible teacher named Steve Gregg, and he has a series on his website, The Narrow Path, called God's Sovereignty and Man's Salvation. And I walked away feeling like I had finally accepted that Calvinism was just no longer tenable. But interestingly enough, there was still something in me that just kept keeping me from jumping ship entirely. This abided for a few more years until now. And I have just finally come to the point where I am abandoning Calvinism altogether. I have reconciled the fact that consistent Calvinism is incompatible with missions, despite many desperate Calvinist claims to the contrary. Can a Calvinist be a zealous man for the lost? Of course he can. But my wife and I were talking the other day, and I said to her, you know, at least for me, there is something psychologically damaging when you are witnessing to someone out of only pure obedience, pure will. There's no freedom in sharing the gospel. I know Calvinists would chafe at this maybe and say, Seth, that's your own psychological problem. It's not inherent in Calvinism. But I just want to say, really? I mean, is that so? Have you really thought about that? Calvinism and Reformed doctrine completely derailed my walk with Christ for 15 years. My zeal for the lost, wanting to go deeper with God, were sidetracked while I had to wrestle for all these years with trying to reconcile why I was doing what I was doing. I kind of wonder if men like William Carey struggled with the same thing. I know Andrew Fuller did. He had to write an entire book called The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation to show Calvinists that they too can still hold on to their Calvinism and be missionaries. Go and listen to John Piper's biographical sermon on Andrew Fuller's life and see how he had to battle against, at the time, what was called high Calvinism, what today we call hyper Calvinism. But honestly, I think what Andrew Fuller was trying to work through was consistent Calvinism versus inconsistent Calvinism. I've heard James White say the only consistent Armenian is an open theist. Well, today I'm going to say that the only consistent Calvinist is a hyper-Calvinist, and a fatalist at that. So I'd like to offer some considerations to you if you're thinking about becoming a Calvinist or have already become a Calvinist within the past 15 years or so, since the sort of Reformed resurgence. So I'm going to give 5 points, no pun intended, and then after that I'm going to give another 5 points of different considerations. So first 5 points are: 1, you are probably more attracted to a culture and a state of mind rather than following the plain reading of Scripture. And what do I mean by this? If you're thinking of becoming a Calvinist or have become a Calvinist in the past 15 years or so, it's likely that you had other things brewing underneath, and Calvinism just served as the perfect catalyst to get you out of your low church evangelicalism, out of a church that didn't preach the wrath of God, or maybe it was too seeker sensitive or too effeminate. It could have been a number of things. Again, there's probably more that you need to do business with in your walk and your local church scenario than thinking accepting tulip is the answer to these problems. Number 2, don't fall for the macho God Calvinism. Is a lot of the evangelical church weak and effeminate? The answer is yes. There's no question about that. Is the answer Calvinism or becoming Reformed? No. Sometimes compassion, even compassion without compromise for the lost and praying for our degenerating culture, can be perceived as weakness by many in these circles. I think you know what I'm talking about. A good portion of Calvinists might endorse an imprecatory prayer, actually, to address our current cultural climate. This is something I was introduced to as a Calvinist, that God hates the sinner. Something I can't go into now in super detail, but I will say, as a side note, I do appreciate that Calvinists will actually deal with these verses, the imprecatory prayers, because a lot of, or most of evangelicalism isn't even willing to deal with it, or they're embarrassed of it, and I do not like that. Unfortunately, though, in my experience personally, the Presbyterian church I attended, and I don't think it's the exception to the rule, was not very reserved in using such prayers in our current context. I heard my pastor say to me once, "We were always taught that God hates the sin but loves the sinner." No, if you read the scriptures, God actually hates the sinner. So be leery of this type of attitude because it will have devastating effects on your view of the lost. Number 3, don't be afraid that if you do not embrace Calvinism, you will be called a semi-Pelagian by your Calvinist friends. This is a term of derision used by Calvinists to demean those who are non-Calvinists or Armenians by basically saying that you're flirting with heresy. And if your Calvinist friend is a true Reformed person through and through, holding to the final conclusions of the Synod of Dort, he will have to pronounce anathema, because that's what they pronounced at Dort. Go back and look. Number 4, Calvinism will change you as a person. If you have a passion for the lost, doing such things as street evangelism, it will likely put cold water on your fire. I don't think that's my experience alone. If it does not, you're probably not a true Calvinist or are an inconsistent Calvinist, or you will just be obeying out of pure will. There's really no other reason to do missions. The great Calvinist missionaries, I believe, were bold for missions not because of their Calvinism, but despite their Calvinism. Number 5, you will have a new lens for reading the scripture and it will box you in. You'll read a lot of passages in the Bible that will not seem to make any sense to your system anymore. But you'll be forced, because of these new lenses, to skip over them or do some serious eisegesis in order to make it fit. Or you will do what every other good Calvinist does when he gets to a passage he cannot explain that conflicts with determinism, and you'll say, it's a mystery. Or, who are you to answer back to God? You know what I'm talking about there too. Now, let me offer 5 other points to keep in mind about Calvinism, certain scriptures to work through, what you may be afraid of losing if you abandon Calvinism, and to point you to some resources. 1, embracing the non-Calvinist or Armenian view, as I've heard Steve Gregg put it in his lectures, really is the default view. All right? You can't go through a plain reading of the Bible and come away a Calvinist. That's probably why all the early church fathers were not Calvinists. I know that's an anachronism, but you know what I mean by that. Maybe I should say they were determinists, or they were not determinists, rather, until St. Augustine came on the scene. If you're not familiar with St. Augustine, he was really the first Christian to teach determinism and sort of codify it and popularize it. He was a philosopher that synthesized, at least from what I can tell and have learned, a lot of his former Manichaeism, Platonism, and Christianity. That's a whole different topic, but the point is, approach the scripture with humility and walk away with its plain reading. Number 2, when you get to Romans 9, keep in mind God's purposes for Israel the entire time you're reading. As you go through each verse, keep thinking back to the beginning of the chapter as to why Paul broached the subject in the first place. What about Israel? Think of that as the big picture as you're reading through it. Don't individualize and cherry pick verses that seem like they're talking about Calvinism and personal salvation, particularly verses 10 through 25, which are really the locus of the Calvinist argument. So look at the whole of chapters 9 through 11. Don't just zone in on these 15 verses in the middle of chapter 9 and think Paul is teaching Calvinism. That's sadly a superficial reading of the scriptures, while Calvinists will try to convince you that it's actually a deeper reading. So consult the best commentators possible in Romans 9. Number 3, read and reread 2 Peter 2:1 and tell me if it supports limited atonement. I truly think it is the Jenga piece that once pulled out will cause all the others to tumble. Number 4, if you're already a Calvinist but are having doubts, it can be scary to change your entire paradigm, but it will be worth it. You probably have fear that all the other glorious things that you learn in the Reformed tradition, like a much more biblical eschatological system, will have to be abandoned. This is not so. You won't become dispensational, secret rapture premillennialist again. You won't become a liberal or so-called progressive Christian. Such worry is a total non sequitur. You will likely find yourself more zealous than before and have more peace in your soul. And number 5, resources. So I can't recommend enough Steve Gregg's At the Narrow Path, his teaching series called God's Sovereignty and Man's Salvation. Steve understands the Calvinist position better than a lot of Calvinists I know. His lectures are Bible saturated and are by far the best I've heard yet on this topic. You can also listen to Leighton Flowers. He's got a good podcast, really good stuff there. He's a former Calvinist. has a particular focus on this topic, and I'm finding his commentary very helpful. There are other authors out there, like the late Dave Hunt. There's also Jerry Walls and Roger Olson. I haven't read any of their stuff, but I've heard them recommended by solid teachers. You'll just have to find out for yourself. So I told my wife the other day, summing this up, what I feel like I'm having to do is untangle a lot of the knots out of my mind. I was so deep into Reformed theology for 15 years that it's not simply like cutting a rope. I've unhitched myself from all Reformed teachers for the time being so that I can breathe a different air and catch my breath as I journey back to some of my other favorite preachers whom I gleaned from before becoming a Calvinist, like Leonard Ravenhill, A.W. Tozer, and others. Calvinism and Reformed theology derailed my Christian walk and witness. Does this happen to everyone? Of course not. But it cannot happen without having some effect. I feel like now I'm finally getting back on track and at more peace with God than many years prior. It was always a conflict. It was always a struggle. Before I became a Calvinist, one of my buddies, who became a Calvinist, was talking with a friend of ours at Calvary Chapel, and this guy was trying to admonish him, and he said, "Man, I've known people who've gone down that road, and when they came out, it was like they were shot out of the other end of a cannon." I'm sure it's not that dramatic for me, but I'm deeply humbled right now, having to admit that I was wrong for 15 years. It has been a journey, but it is a journey I am glad I am coming out of. Thank you for watching, and God bless.